Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Sally Burdett. Our top stories. The EU hands out the top jobs after the election, but right-wing parties accuse them of failing to recognise their success.
Tear gas and rubber bullets. Kenyan police confront protesters a day after the president's U-turn on tax increases.
Order is restored on the streets of Bolivia following a failed coup attempt.
Reform and modernisation take centre stage as China sets out its domestic and international ambitions.
And Boeing flies into more flack. This time, why was a mechanic contracted to repair planes sacked for speaking up about safety?
The Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni and the Hungarian leader Viktor Orban have criticised a potential deal on top EU jobs, saying it overlooks the success of the right-wing parties in European parliamentary elections.
EU leaders are meeting in Brussels to finalise an agreement which includes a second term for Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. The deal was negotiated among centre-right and socialist groupings. Meloni says it ignores the wishes of more right-wing voters after that group took third place in the parliament.
Well, let's talk now to our correspondent Alex Cadier, watching events for us in Brussels. Alex, is this a done deal? What can we expect to hear from these talks?
Well, Jamie, it's not a done deal in the sense that it won't be a unanimous decision yet. That's the opposition we've heard from Giorgia Meloni, from Viktor Orban, and we know that that is the goal. It isn't necessary for these top jobs to be approved, but it is the goal. It's the European Union spirit. They want to have all member states on board, particularly to prevent political headaches going forward, with member states saying, well, we have this top diplomat, we have this European Commission president, and we didn't want them to begin with. We don't want to work with them now. That is the risk further down the line. But it's a packed agenda. The leaders discussing Ukraine and the Russian invasion. Of course, President Zelensky was here signing that security agreement with the European Union. The Middle East is also on the agenda. The strategic direction of the European Union for the next 5 years also going to be discussed. But that big question of those top jobs, Ursula von der Leyen coming back to the European Commission, ditto Roberta Metsola at the European Parliament, the Portuguese Prime Minister Antonio Costa coming here to the European Council, and Kaja Kallas, the hawkish Estonian Prime Minister, going to Josep Borrell's old job as the EU's top diplomat. That is what we'll be looking forward to for the next 5 years, setting that direction, setting the face of the European Union. But that deal will probably go late into the night because they've saved the best for last. The negotiations on top jobs will be the last point on the agenda today.
Just how significant is this challenge by Giorgia Meloni, who has support from other EU members, countries like Hungary?
Yeah, she has support from Viktor Orban, but the rest of the member states are on board for those top jobs as I described them. But significantly, that means that the deal could go through. All they need is a majority to have these jobs agreed, and therefore that opposition is important symbolically, politically. As I said, they want to have that unanimous support for these appointments, but it isn't entirely necessary. So the question isn't about if, it's about when. Certainly late into the evening, that is what some of the leaders are expecting. And how? Well, whether or not all leaders will be brought on board with these appointments. What will happen in the next few hours, what's happening behind the scenes, is a certain amount of horse trading, of recognition. We've seen the Polish Prime Minister saying there is no Europe without Italy. We've seen Olaf Scholz saying all member states are equally critical to this decision. The word love bombing has been used to describe how other leaders are now treating the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni to bring her on board. We'll have to wait the next few hours to see if it works.
Alex, thank you for that. Our correspondent Alex Cadier in Brussels.
China's Ministry of Commerce is reviewing complaints from firms about what it's called the biased practices of the European Union. This comes after the EU launched investigations into Chinese imports in sectors including electric vehicles, solar power equipment and security devices. Chinese exporters say the EU's investigations restrict their products and services from entering the European market and negatively affect trade.
China's major industrial companies saw profits grow by 3.4% year-on-year in the first 5 months of 2024. That growth rate narrowed from 4.3% between January and April. The equipment manufacturing sector continued to be the main driver of growth, rising 11.5% on the previous year.
Farmers in Denmark could soon be taxed for gases emitted by their cows, sheep and pigs. The measure proposed by the government could begin in 2030 as they tackle methane emissions. The so-called flatulence tax would be a world first, costing farmers over $100 per cow by 2035. Livestock contributes to over 14% of global greenhouse gas emissions.
Air freight operators have increased their greenhouse gas emissions by 25% since 2019. That's according to the campaign group Stand by Earth. In 2023, there were 300,000 more flights than in 2019. Air cargo has risen due to shoppers expecting faster deliveries. The United States accounts for 40% of global air freight emissions. Anti-government demonstrators have returned to the streets of the Kenyan capital, Nairobi, in defiance of warnings from the authorities.
Police have fired tear gas and rubber bullets to disperse crowds. There's a heavy deployment of security forces and roads are blocked around key buildings. This comes a day after President William Ruto withdrew a finance bill that would have raised taxes. At least 23 people have been killed during clashes. Our correspondent Robert Nagila is in Nairobi. Hello, Robert. You know, there's a huge security presence. The protests, we understand, continue. What's happening currently?
Well, there's still a lot of tension across the country following those deadly protests on Tuesday, in which at least 10 people were killed while trying to force their way into Parliament following the passing of the finance bill by the people's representatives. Now, Thursday was marked by running battles between police and protesters throughout the capital city, Nairobi. There are still pockets of protesters in the capital city as we speak, but it's been relatively calm for most of the day, and as it is right now. However, there is a tight security presence across the entire capital and indeed across the country. The military was deployed early this morning across Nairobi, which is unprecedented. The last time we saw the military deployed in the capital city was in 2007, when during the post-election violence. So those scenes have played across people's TVs across the country, creating a lot of unease, but it is relatively calm. The government says that it is in control of the situation. Now, on Wednesday, President William Ruto basically withdrew the finance bill after doubling down on Tuesday, saying that he had had the people's voice and that it would go back to Parliament. However, that process is still up in the air because Parliament went on a very hurried short recess. So we're still waiting to hear from them as to when they will come back.
Yeah, so that bill, in a way, is in limbo, potentially not completely off the table, one wonders. How damaging have these events been actually for President William Ruto?
Oh, it's been very damaging for the president since he's been in office for the last, 24 months. They've spent a lot of time crafting this image on the international circuit of a Democrat. He's seen as somebody who listens. Climate change and finance have been his pet projects. He's talked about revolutionizing, re-energizing Kenya's economy, but we have to also accept that he came in and found that there was a lot of debt. However, a lot of people do remind him that he was deputy president when the country had gone on this borrowing binge for mega infrastructural projects. How damaging has it been? Well, very damaging. Now that a lot of experts are saying now that he has offered this olive branch and withdrawn this bill, it does open up Pandora's box, because the protesters, from their point of view, say that it's not just about this finance bill, which was seeking to introduce new taxes and increase the current taxes as well. They say that there's a host of issues that this government needs to work on, including corruption, education, the health sector. They say that they're already paying a lot of taxes, but the services they're getting are not commensurate with what they're paying. So they have to go back to the drawing table, and it's going to be an uphill task from here.
Thank you so much for that update. That's our correspondent in Nairobi, Robert Nagila.
Well, Kenya's tax bill may have been withdrawn, but the protests, of course, continue, as we've been seeing. Reginald Kazutu, a financial analyst, explains perhaps why.
I think the first thing that the government of Ruto should have done, especially in 2022 when they had a chance, and they can still do it now, is to bring the creditors on the table and tell them, in the current structure and form that our debt is in, at current interest rates that that debt is in, we are actually not able to pay, because this year alone they're going to spend close to 1.8 trillion shillings versus ordinary revenue of around 2.5 trillion. That's 70% of all the taxes they're going to collect are going to pay debt. It is not sustainable. It's not going to work. And the solution for borrowing from John to pay Peter is just kicking the can down the road. So they need to actually call creditors on the table and say, give us some fiscal space to grow the economy so that we're able to pay you, allow us to put fiscal policies that actually help grow the economy. But as it is right now, I don't think Kenya can pay its debt without the help of IMF and World Bank.
All right, order is being restored to Bolivia after an apparent coup attempt failed. A number of senior military officials have been arrested after armoured vehicles rammed the doors of the presidential palace in La Paz.
It came after weeks of growing unrest in the South American country, where President Luis Arce is facing a challenge to his leadership from the former leader, Evo Morales.
Let's talk to our correspondent Dan Collins in La Paz. Hello, Dan. So, Morales has condemned the coup, but are we actually any clearer on why this military faction acted the way they did and whether they've been fully contained?
Hello, Sally. Well, I think that is still very much something that is a cause of speculation here. There's a lot of different information coming out about who may have been behind this coup, and it often depends on who you speak to. For example, if you speak to supporters of Evo Morales, they might say it's President Arce who's in the government palace behind me, or if you speak to opposition members, they might say that it's President Arce. But what is clear is that this very short-lived coup just lasted 3 hours, and just behind me you can see the wrought iron gates, which were just less than 24 hours ago rammed open by an armoured vehicle, and the then coup leader, the former army chief Juan Jose Zuniga, walked down into this passageway where he was confronted by President Luis Arce, flanked by his cabinet ministers. And these are the images which you've seen in local media, and perhaps the defining images of this attempted, very short-lived coup, in which he took about 5 minutes of argument for Luis Arce to basically make this former general stand down, withdraw, and he was later arrested. And then, of course, there was a change of the heads of the armed forces. The soldiers were ordered back to their barracks, and we are now in that very same place, and we've seen many people here, many of them tourists, and many of them curious Bolivians who are coming to see what's going on. It's entirely peaceful, and some of the local community groups, supporters of different political factions, have come out to make declarations here. But what is clear is a coup has been averted, although Bolivia's longer-term problems of political infighting and economic crisis will continue.
So where does this leave Bolivia? Is it possible to say? Because next year there's an election. Morales says he's going to fight to regain power.
That's right, Sally. Now, Evo Morales, of course, has strong popular support, but he's divided the most popular party, the party he founded, the Movement Towards Socialism, or MAS party. It's now divided between former President Evo Morales, who was ousted in 2019 over allegations of electoral fraud, and his successor from the same party and his former finance minister, the current President Luis Arce. Of course, there are also opposition political groups as well who will be fighting this election in 2025. What's not clear at this moment is whether Evo Morales will be allowed to run in the 2025 election, and that, of course, is the bone of contention at this moment, because clearly Luis Arce and his supporters says that Evo Morales has had his time. He's had more than 12 years in office, and it's time for him to give room for other leaders to take the fore in the party, the government party of MAS. But that doesn't mean that the economic crisis of the current moment is being solved. And it looks like it could possibly get worse. Dollars are extremely scarce at the moment, and there is also talk that the current president, Luis Arce, may try to lift fuel subsidies, which is likely to be an unpopular move. And of course, in pre-electoral mode, that's something that he may want to avoid. But the political tensions continue here in Bolivia, but on the streets there is calm, and I think Bolivians united yesterday evening on Wednesday. This plaza was filled with people supporting the fact that a coup had been averted, as on the balcony behind me, the President Luis Arce was speaking to the crowd and talking to them and thanking them for mobilizing and organizing themselves onto the streets to make this coup stand down. And that's what we're seeing here on the streets of La Paz today.
All right, well, thank you so much for that update. That, of course, is Dan Collins in La Paz.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, dozens of Palestinians are killed as overnight strikes hit Gaza, with reports that Israeli tanks are moving into Gaza City.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
I think it should be more global cooperation.
I would like to hear more the voice of the developing countries.
Globalization has lifted more than 1 billion people out of poverty.
The green transition has to happen. It's a necessity.
Well, China and the United States are important powers in the world.
What unites us is much more than what divides us.
And I believe China is committed to this agenda.
Join me, Juliet Mann, to set the agenda at these times every weekend on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Gaza continues to be hit by airstrikes, with around 50 people killed in the past 24 hours. This is according to Palestinian health authorities.
This comes amid reports that Israeli tanks are moving into Gaza City, where families are attempting to flee after evacuation orders from the Israeli Defense Forces. Our correspondent Akram Al-Satari is in Gaza.
Well, indeed, strikes continuing overnight and targeting areas that used to be calm in the past few months or so. Some of them are Al-Shaja'iyya, some of them is Al-Zaytun, and some areas that are in Khan Yunis, Gaza Central area, and Rafah as well. Those strikes took the life of 50 Palestinians in the last 24 hours and also took the lives of 13 Palestinians in the last couple of hours. 8 of them were killed in Al-Shaja'iyya neighborhood that has been witnessing an intensified intensified bombardment because of the ground operation that started in Al-Shaja'iyya. And according to the Israeli sources, this is a new operation for the sake of just removing the ability of Hamas to continue ruling on the ground and to target any groups that have come together for the sake of placing and enhancing order and control of Hamas on the ground. Also in Nusayrat in Gaza Central area, a house was targeted. 4 people were confirmed to be dead, and in Rafah area, 1 person was killed. In Khan Yunis, there were several bombardments in Khan Yunis East area. So overall, it is an intensified operation, not in particular line or geographical zone in Gaza, but rather in all different fronts, with the Israeli government talking about the possibility of just starting phase 3, which seems to be carrying more death and destruction for the people of Palestine. In Al-Shaja'iyya, around 5 different houses were targeted in the last couple of hours. Houses in Al-Shaja'iyya neighborhood, houses in At-Tuffah neighborhood, and houses in Ad-Daraj neighborhood, houses in Al-Zaytun neighborhood. So the situation continues to be very dire, and the bombardment continue, and they have been targeting different places, and they have been renewed in different places, which means more destruction is brought to the people of Gaza, while the Israeli government or the Israeli army asked the Palestinians who are living in 4 main neighborhoods in Gaza City to move south, which means they have been asked to move from their homes in Al-Shaja'iyya, At-Turkman, Ad-Daraj, and At-Tuffah towards Gaza north and southern area, which means another large wave of displacement from those areas to areas in Khan Yunis, which means a very large ground operation has just started, and it looks like it's going to aggravate further and take more life and destroy more houses and infrastructures.
Akram al-Satari in Gaza. Israeli protesters have blocked highways across the country, demanding an election to replace Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
In Tel Aviv, a metal cage was set on fire, bringing vehicles to a standstill amid continuing anger over kidnapped hostages held in Gaza. This comes as the Israeli Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant, says he's discussed plans for post-conflict Gaza with senior officials in the United States. Well, our correspondent Jonathan Regev is in Tel Aviv. Jonathan, what else has the Defense Minister said as he ends this trip to Washington?
Some comments coming from the Defense Minister angering the Prime Minister and angering his coalition partners. As you mentioned, Gallant spoke in the U.S. of post-war Gaza. That is something that the far-right components of the coalition do not really want to discuss. They do not want to see any kind of Palestinian control in Gaza. Of course, we're not speaking of Hamas, but possibly the Palestinian Authority. This is something that the U.S. perhaps would like to see happening. Maybe even Yoav Gallant could see it happening in one scenario or another, but the far-right ministers, Itamar Ben-Gvir, Bezalel Smotrich, they do not want to see it. But they're not the only ones angry at Gallant. In a comment made yesterday, Gallant said that the differences with the United States should be discussed behind closed doors, maybe hinting against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who was public about the differences with the U.S. in that video he posted a week ago. And sources next to Netanyahu said about Gallant, we've tried to solve the differences with the Americans behind closed doors. We've not been able to do it. That is why Netanyahu went out publicly. So anger on that sense. Anger also on the streets. As you mentioned, more and more protests against the government. Those that have been going on for quite some time, which you mentioned, calling for a hostage deal. Let's remember 120 hostages still held in Gaza. But as we speak now, another protest taking place of the ultra-Orthodox who are concerned with the draft bill and the decision by the Supreme Court, which was taken yesterday. And we know that Gallant is opposing to any kind of a compromise which favors the ultra-Orthodox. So Gallant is back home to quite an uneasy situation for him.
Jonathan, the protests continue as we've been watching, and diplomacy too, of course, but so too the military casualties. An Israeli soldier has been killed and others injured during this operation in the West Bank.
Yes, Jamie, and we constantly speak of the Gaza front and the Lebanon front, but the West Bank front is active all the time. IDF forces are acting in the West Bank, especially in the area of Jenin. And overnight, quite a sophisticated attack against forces coming in. There was an IED which exploded against one of the cars which was coming in, causing minor damage and minor injuries. But then soldiers who came in by foot to rescue the damaged cars were hit by another IED, and one of them was killed. As you mentioned, those IEDs were buried deep in the ground. We know that forces, before the forces come in, bulldozers actually lift the roads, understanding that there are IEDs under the roads. These specific IEDs were buried deep underground, and they also carried quite a large amount of explosives, and when they detonated, they were able to hit a car, then to kill a soldier. Quite a sophisticated attack, and the IDF will have to take that into consideration as it goes into Palestinian population centers, because this front is active. We're speaking of two fronts. We should actually be speaking of three fronts, because the West Bank arena is very active as well.
Jonathan, thank you for that. Our correspondent Jonathan Regev in Tel Aviv.
The United Kingdom is gearing up to vote for a new government in a week's time on July the 4th. We're looking at different issues on voters' minds, and we've been across the country examining the key policies. Our correspondent Jen Copestake reports from Southend in the east of England about concerns regarding the country's healthcare system.
The city of Southend-on-Sea has been a popular seaside resort for hundreds of years. It is famous for having the world's longest pleasure pier, stretching over 2 kilometers into the sea. But in this election, it has gained attention for very different reasons, having some of England's longest waiting times for NHS treatment. The waiting list for routine hospital treatment is on the rise again in England, according to NHS figures. At the end of April, there were 7.57 million appointments on backlog. That's up 30,000 from the previous month. More than 300,000 people have been waiting for over a year. In Southend-on-Sea, 1 in 5 people are currently on a waiting list for routine treatment. Carol Crowhurst, a retired intensive care nurse, is one of them. For the last 10 months, she has been waiting to see a specialist to set a date for needed surgery.
My only concern is now whether on the 2nd of July, if the doctors decide to strike again, that appointment might get cancelled, and then I might have to wait another 10 months for an appointment.
Working in A&E, Carol saw patients with long waits taking matters into their own hands.
They were waiting for a hip operation or a knee operation specifically, couldn't get pain-free, so they'd come to A&E as a last resort, really. It clogs it up with people who don't really need to be there.
Her husband Philip waited 2 years for knee surgery. He lost his job as a truck driver while he was waiting.
I used to have to jump in and out of the trucks. I couldn't jump up, and if I did jump up, I used to fall out. And then in the end, getting up the steps, because the trucks are higher, and also driving them, I couldn't do the job, so they made me redundant.
When the day of his surgery came around, it was cancelled after a 12-hour wait and rescheduled 2 months later. Philip has recently been diagnosed with a neurological disorder and found himself on the waiting list again for routine checks on the condition.
You normally get a follow-up to go and see a doctor at the end of every year. But the last time it got cancelled, and I waited about 7 or 8 months for another appointment, so it went on and on and on. If you're someone who's got it really, really bad, then something like that would have been a disaster for you.
Campaigners in Southend are keeping these issues in the spotlight in the election campaign.
In the election, people will be looking at who promises to invest in the NHS and who means it and what their plans are, but we'll be encouraging people to ask those questions. You know, what is your plan? How are you going to restore funding to the NHS? We've seen 14 years of cuts to pay for people in the health service, which is one of the main reasons why we so short of staff. But of course, we've also seen 14 years of underfunding of the basic services.
We approached the Mid and South Essex NHS Foundation Trust about the long waiting times for patients. In a statement, Andrew Pike, Chief Operating Officer, said, "This is one of the largest trusts in the country, Patients are seen in order of clinical priority. We understand waiting for any treatment or surgery is always difficult and are sorry that some people have had to wait longer than we want them to. For Carol, Philip, and many others in Southend, restoring their faith in the NHS is the key issue for the election and will be a key challenge for whoever leads the next government. Jen Copestake, CGTN, Southend-on-Sea.
Well, the forthcoming French election is being fought by candidates from across the political spectrum, but three main parties or groupings have come to prominence. The Renaissance Party, the National Rally, and a newly formed left-leaning grouping, the New Popular Front. So who are the main players and what are they promising if they get into government? Well, Renaissance, the party of President Emmanuel Macron and Prime Minister Gabriel Attal, is the centrist alliance formed back in 2022. It lost its absolute majority in Parliament in the same year. The latest opinion polls has it trailing the National Rally. The cost of living is a big concern for voters in France. Renaissance says it's the only party that is fiscally responsible, saying while it won't increase taxes, it's not promising any giveaways either. President Macron's controversial pension reforms have been rather unpopular. He's raised the retirement age from 62 to 64, something other parties have promised to reverse. Macron has introduced policies aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions, cutting dependence on fossil fuels, and boosting the take-up of electric cars. He says plans to reduce the country's emissions by 55% by the end of this decade are attainable. But the European Union's Green Deal, which France supports, has caused anger among farmers. France's position on supporting Ukraine has hardened somewhat. Initially, President Macron pushed for a diplomatic resolution, but recently he raised the possibility of Western troops on the ground in Ukraine. In June, France announced it was sending Mirage 2000 fighter jets to Kyiv. Although inflation generally is decreasing in France, many people may not be feeling the benefit in their wallets and their purses, with food and energy prices still on the rise. So the cost of living is likely to influence millions of people in these elections. Our correspondent Evangelo Sipsas reports now from Paris.
When he arrives at his working site, Nelson makes sure that all measures are in place to ensure the safety of the public, his colleagues, and himself. As a supervisor at this construction site, he is responsible for people's security, but he's not feeling so secure away from work.
I feel financially insecure. Will I have enough money? We managed to pay for what we need, but the future is uncertain. I'm raising a little girl alone. Will I be able to pay for her education if she wants to become a vet, which is very expensive? Will I be able to afford it?
And it's the same when Nelson goes shopping. Instead of a weekly shop, he now only buys what he needs for the day.
A few years back, I could walk into the market with 70 euros, buy what I needed and not think twice. Today, that same 70 euros is a source of worry as I meticulously check prices. The shift from carefree to cautious is not just a change in lifestyle, it's a shift in moral security.
Last September, the French government introduced a number of measures aimed at tackling the rising cost of living. They raised welfare and pension payouts and brought in fuel vouchers and discounts. But French people continue to feel the pinch, with everyday staples higher than last year. Many have taken to the streets to express their anger. But according to Warren Dale, a local politician and member of the Yellow Vest movement, no one is listening.
It's worse than before. There's a growing divide in France between the working class and the rich. Despite protests and numerous appeals from humanitarian and human rights associations, the government doesn't listen.
While the measures in September were meant to relieve thousands of households struggling, inflation went up 0.1%, but energy costs increased in May by 2% from April. And that seems to be on the mind of the million of French when casting their ballots. Evangelo Sipsas for CGTN,
Paris.
You can get highlights from the week's news in Europe and China direct to your inbox from CGTN's Storyboard email newsletter. Sign up at europe.cgtn.com/newsletter.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Can you really grow the world's economy without it costing the Earth?
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Sally Baudet. Our top stories. The EU hands out the top jobs after the election, but right-wing parties accuse them of failing to recognise their success.
For other headlines, tear gas and rubber bullets. Kenyan police confront protesters a day after the president's U-turn on tax increases.
Order is restored on the streets of Bolivia following a failed coup attempt.
Reform and modernisation will be centre stage at the third plenary session of the 20th Commission of the Communist Party of China on the 15th of July.
This year, China is hoping to reach its 5% GDP growth target. President Xi has been calling for high-quality development. He's promised further opening up to the world and the transformation of China into a high-standard market economy. The government has recently adopted measures to boost consumption and reduce financial risks.
Now, what's called the Summer Davos concludes today in China. China's economic outlook and other future trends, like emerging technologies, remain the most sought-after sessions. Our correspondent Wang Tianyu reports.
The Summer Davos Forum connects people and ideas from all over the world. This year's annual meeting in Dalian attracted over 1,700 representatives from more than 100 countries and regions. The forum featured approximately 200 events and nearly 50 meetings were live-streamed online. These figures set a new historical record.
In my sector, I had a great opportunity to connect with leaders from the GCC, from the Asia region, leaders in pharma, and have that discussion and dialogue of how can we partner, how can we deliver value and deliver more predictive and proactive care delivery to the hands of the patients.
Participants shared their insights on economy, technology, and innovations under the theme, The Next Frontiers for Growth. And one of the most crucial frontiers for growth is green economy. The Summer Davos Forum aimed to encourage more societies to embrace sustainability through its own actions. All the electricity used in the conference center is 100% green power, which means they're generated with zero carbon emissions. And the schedules of meetings and sessions are all paperless. They're all on our phones. For new energy-related companies, the forum is a platform to create opportunities for future cooperation.
I'm looking for strategic partnership with other industries players. For example, how to adopt the AI and other digital technology into renewable energy sectors. We have some fruitful talks with some the AI companies, the software companies. I think that we have a very in-depth dialogues. We are looking for some the future concrete cooperation among us.
For most of the attendees, the 3-day event is just a gateway to future opportunities. Follow-up communications and execution of relevant initiatives are what they look forward to next. Wang Tianyu, CGTN, Dalian, Liaoning Province.
Staying with the summer Davos, Zia Zhou is the head of international engagement and innovation at the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership.
The summer Davos is taking place halfway through a very significant year with multiple elections and also with some geopolitical conflicts, also with trade wars going on. So it's very important. That's why the focus of the Davos has really been what is the long-term growth, what is the next new frontier of growth, what do we mean growth, where is the better growth, how can we make sure the economic growth and the well-being and as well as the nature and the climate, they are all balanced. So we're not having economic growth at the cost of the nature and environment.
Yeah, that is so crucial, isn't it? Because profit tends to lead the way. Historically, it's led the way. And if we carry on like that, we are not going to have a planet to live on one of these days. So how do we rewire for that change in terms of a greener economy?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. I think there is no business that could survive, let alone thrive, on a dead planet. So when it comes to how could we rewire, we really need to think about the whole system transformation. There is a lot of hype about a certain technology, about ESG, but we've seen those certain technology or ESG disclosure could only take us far, but we really need to fundamentally thinking about the consumptionism of the society, about the focus or even challenge the relentless growth that we wanted, which is based on the fossil fuel, based on the booming of industry. So I think how to revisit the whole paradigm shift is really the key thing, and take into account invest in people, incorporate nature and the biodiversity in all of these things.
Is the money following this trend, this awareness about preserving our planet?
To a certain degree, but it's definitely insufficient to achieve what we want at speed and scale. For example, I spoke to some of those entrepreneurs and innovators. So they are selected by WEF, Uplink, as the top innovators. And the common challenge that I've heard again and again is about the finance, is about money. One example is some of the startups, they are really in deep tech. Probably they're doing something with huge investment upfront to build the facility in terms of carbon capture. But there isn't a VC is willing to take the risk, or there is no patient capital willing to invest into those deep tech startups. So we can see there is a massive shortage there for deep tech startups. And on the other hand, for startups who have got their business, have got a solution, there is a shortage of money to really scale them up. So the quicker we could scale them up, of course, the better outcome it would achieve. But unfortunately, the money is really missing on both fronts.
Boeing is resuming delivery of wide-body planes to China after a regulatory review stopped them.
Orders of Boeing's wide-body 777 and 787 are expected soon, along with the 737 MAX plane, which is at the centre of safety scandals. The pause in delivery was due to a review of batteries in the 25-hour cockpit voice recorder.
Now, that may be good news for Boeing, but it seems the plane manufacturer just can't stay out of the news headlines. Let's talk to our correspondent, John Terrett, in New York. John, I thought we'd get through a week without another one of these stories coming out, but more damning criticism about safety. Just brief us on this one.
No. Yeah, no chance of that, mate. I'm afraid the problem here is that PR crisis management companies are trying to help Boeing, and they simply can't get out in front of all the bad news. And the latest news is that another whistleblower has stepped forward in the last 24 hours, saying there could be disastrous consequences for things he's seen in the building of the 787 Dreamliner. He's called Richard Kuvas, and this is where Boeing has gone wrong here. Listen to this. He works for a company called Strom. You've never heard of Strom. I've never heard of Strom, and yet they are suppliers to Spirit Aerosystems, which is a supplier in turn to Boeing. Do you see, this is one of the problems. They've lost control of all their suppliers all over the country. Kuvas says he saw improperly drilled holes in the forward bulkhead of the 787s. He reported it in 2023 and was promptly sacked. Boeing says, we investigated what he said, we found nothing wrong. The problem is these whistleblowers keep coming out of the woodwork. One came out of the woodwork just before David Calhoun appeared before the Senate last week in a very extraordinary appearance in which he turned to the families of the 737 victims and apologized to them and took responsibility. Those families want Boeing to be fined $25 billion as part of an agreement that went slightly awry from 2021. If that happens, it will cripple Boeing. They will not be able to operate as a fully fledged aircraft manufacturer. And on top of all that, prosecutors are recommending to the Department of Justice that they now criminally investigate and charge members of the Boeing management structure. The Department of Justice has until the 7th of July to decide whether to do that. Meanwhile, Boeing shares are up almost 2% this morning, major Dow Jones component. And I think the reason for that is that Wall Street thinks that they will sort this out eventually. But it's going to take a very long time.
John, let's just put that to one side. I want to ask you about another story that gets huge traction in the United States. It doesn't get so much coverage in Europe. It's about this opioid epidemic that's killed thousands of people in the United States. There's been another twist and another turn in this story. Just tell us about this.
Yeah, this is a completely unique American story. It hasn't happened anywhere else in the world. It revolves around a company called Purdue Pharmaceutical that was struggling and thought that they would market painkillers that were basically heroin wrapped in sugar coating. They did this with the backing of the authorities. And that's good if it kills your pain. The problem is thousands and thousands of people got addicted to this stuff, and they aggressively and egregiously marketed this drug that was called OxyContin. I can't tell you some of the things they got up to in marketing this drug on a family program, but you can probably imagine. The problem is the pills found their way to teenagers who got addicted, who sold them around their housing estates and things, and the number of opioid deaths from overdose went from 3,000 in 1999 to 17,000 in 2017 and stayed there until about 2020. So the states went after Purdue Pharmaceutical and the family that ran them, the Sacklers. They were very, very keen to get their hands on the money to help the victims' families and to help for reparations at the state level. The deal that was done shielded the Sackler family from further prosecution and meant they kept almost all of their fortune. It was done under the bankruptcy laws of the United States. And now today, the Supreme Court has ruled that that was an inappropriate use of bankruptcy laws. Justice Gorsuch, writing the opinion, says that the code for bankruptcy doesn't contemplate, much less authorize, such a deal, and that the Sacklers wanted to shield themselves from wrongful death and fraud allegations in future court cases, and this is the key point, without putting anything close to all their assets on the table. So there you go. They rushed to get this deal through. Everybody was happy with it, the families, the states, the Sacklers, and now the Supreme Court has voided it because it was an inappropriate use of the wrong kind of law. So they all have to start again.
John, thank you for that. Our correspondent John Terrett in New York.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, the words that might win the White House. America's two presidential candidates go head-to-head in their first debate of this election campaign.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw.
The cleanup operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So now we've actually become the border on this road.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
the economic impact is bound to ripple across the country. There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the living area of the crew.
The focus is firmly on future technologies.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. US President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump will go head-to-head in the first debate ahead of November's election.
It will be hosted by CNN in Atlanta, from where Associated Press correspondent Philip Crowther joins us. Hello, Philip. So millions of Americans are expected to tune into this first debate. Just how high are the stakes?
Yeah, they're very high. It is actually a very early time in the electoral calendar for us to be talking about a debate. Usually these things happen in September or October, but here we are at the end of June, a decision taken together by the two campaigns, in fact. There will be a lot of people watching, millions, yes, absolutely. According to an Associated Press poll, there will in fact be a majority of US adults who will be watching at least part of this debate. Maybe they will only see some clips or snippets of it, and of course nowadays that might be more important than the actual overall performance of these two candidates during those 90 minutes of this televised debate, because those clips, they can be played again and again all the way until Election Day. So what might the two campaigns be looking for? Well, the Trump campaign, maybe a moment of weakness from President Joe Biden. After all, it is the Trump campaign that has been talking about his mental weakness for months now. Maybe also they will want to see a particularly strong attack by former President Donald Trump on his opponent. For President Joe Biden, there are all sorts of attacks that he can come up with, or that may be subject matters that the moderators might be able to ask Donald Trump about. His support for some of the insurrectionists from January 6th. They might ask him whether he is willing this time around to accept the election results. Remember that Donald Trump still has not conceded after losing to Joe Biden in 2020. Donald Trump might also be asked about his closeness to Russian President Vladimir Putin. All of these are possible moments that could work out really well for the Joe Biden campaign. The stakes are very high indeed, and as we mentioned, this comes very early in the electoral calendar, before these two candidates are even officially the nominees of their respective parties.
Yeah, so exactly how does Joe Biden counter those baseless accusations that Donald Trump has made?
And there will probably be quite a few on stage as well. This, after all, is something that we're used to from the former president. There are many lies from him on stage during his rallies all around the country, and there might be some more on stage here today. There have been so many, first of all, about who even won the election in 2020. That is considered the big lie, the one where Donald Trump says he won 4 years ago, which of course is not true. They both have been a little bit misleading, or very misleading in some cases, about how strong their respective economies were or are during their presidencies. But also Donald Trump, for example, has said that other countries are sending people from their prisons or mental health institutions to cross the border between Mexico and the United States. That, of course, is wrong as well. So how will Joe Biden be able to, well, stop those things from happening on stage? In theory, you'd say, well, interrupt the other candidate. but he won't be able to do that because there are some very specific rules that both campaigns have agreed to here on stage in Atlanta. The most important one of which is the fact that the microphones will be muted, or rather the microphone of the person who is not talking or who shouldn't be talking, that one will be muted while the other candidate is giving a response to the moderators. This also, by the way, is a debate that is happening without an audience. It's just a TV studio, just the two candidates and the two anchors from the news channel CNN. The stakes are high, as we mentioned, but there is going to be one more debate, and that is going to happen in September.
It's going to be very interesting to see how it plays out. Thank you so much, Philip Crowther of Associated Press.
Well, let's talk to Rina Shah, a political strategist and commentator and former Republican presidential campaign advisor. Rina, good to see you. Welcome. Two elderly men who sometimes struggle to stay on message. No notes in this debate, no bathroom breaks. How do you think these candidates will prepare?
Well, certainly a test of endurance this will be, and I'd be lying if I said that wasn't part of the calculation and part of the prep to get to where they are going to be tonight. Now, I think the interesting part about tonight is that this is the rematch that seemingly nobody wanted from coast to coast in these United States. You ask voters, and people are not particularly thrilled to see the duo meet again. But that is what makes tonight's debate very different. Traditionally, we've been able to see newcomers. We've been able to meet people on stage for the first time. We already know what these two men bring to the table because they both have sat behind that great big desk in the Oval Office before.
You know, journalists and political wonks get excited about these things. I mean, does the great American public really care? Do you think this debate will make any real difference? It's often said that voters make up their minds months before elections.
Well, that's been the talk up until now, and that would be conventional wisdom, is that because these two men are very well known, not only to their bases, but to also this independently minded, undecided voter that is out there in particularly 7 or 6 swing states, depending on which ones we're talking about. You know, Joe Biden seems to be faring well, for example, in the Rust Belt states, while Donald Trump tends to have a greater following in those Sun Belt states. So I'm talking about for Joe Biden, we're talking about Michigan, Wisconsin, places like that. And for Trump, again, Arizona, Nevada, Georgia is where he tends to have a greater following and a better sense of support is what I'm talking about here. But back to what makes this matchup on a debate stage so interesting is that we will be looking at the two oldest candidates we've ever seen for president try to sell to the American public an idea of how they can make our lives better over the next 4 years. That is something that could really change the game after tonight, depending on how they frame their arguments.
Each of these guys will have spin doctors, directors of communication. We both know how this all works. Do these people try and get the candidates to retain key messages, key sentences? How do you think it's going to work, given what we know of both of their live performances on television?
Well, I myself have been one of those people before. I've been retained by not only candidates who run for U.S. Congress, but I have advised a Republican presidential primary candidate as well as an independent candidate for president. And I can tell you it's always the same. For me, I would always want to give a candidate a very memorable acronym to go into the night with, something that would tether them back to the point of why they're standing behind that podium. So for Trump, for me, if I were advising him, which I have not, I would say he has to do TCI, which is teach, convince, and inspire. He needs to teach the American public something that they may not know about Biden that would make Biden not a great choice for the next 4 years, perhaps something Biden did or his administration has done in these 4 years that would make Americans question whether they want to take their chance on him again. Now, convincing is also, I think, the hardest part here. Convincing the folks that are out there who didn't vote for him in 2020 that they should vote for him now. Again, a very tall order. And then lastly, inspire. We all know that the base will turn out to support these two candidates on the Democrat side, on the Republican side, but inspire those people who were planning to stay home to get off the sidelines and vote for him. That is what Trump really needs to do, especially because he's had a chance in the White House before. That's what makes this entire thing so unique.
Rina, let's hope they remember their acronyms. Good to talk to you. We'll watch with interest later on. Thank you very much, Rina Shah, the political strategist and commentator.
Certainly. Thank you.
And finally, one of the world's most popular orchestras, the Berlin Philharmonic, is touring Shanghai. The orchestra is performing 4 symphonies and 7 chamber concerts during its 10-day visit. Grammy award-winning Chinese pianist Yu Jiawang is joining them for 2 performances.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
Up next, Africa Live. See you again tomorrow. From all of us here in London, goodbye.
Bye.